Peace be upon you. In this episode, we'll evaluate the most important pillars of what is known as Darwin's theory of evolution. Charles Darwin is an English naturalist who reported many observations, some he had collected during his travels and some observed by others, like the morphological and anatomical similarities between different organisms and their geographical distribution patterns. Based on these observations, he assumed that all living organisms come from a common origin through processes of evolution and diversification, where the organism undergoes slight cumulative changes, then nature sifts and chooses. Thus, beneficial changes are preserved by nature, resulting in a new species over thousands and millions of years. According to Darwin, nature has exterminated an innumerable number of transitional forms where harmful or useless changes occurred. In addition to nature's sifting role, he hypothesized that nature contributes to the development of new traits in organisms. So, when an organism acquires certain traits, in response to the environment, it passes on these traits to its offspring, in line with Lamarck's hypothesis that the long-necked giraffe was once short-necked, but environmental changes and the need to stretch its neck to eat from the treetops elongated its neck across generations until it became what it is today. The crucial point here is Darwin's assumption that living organisms resulted from these changes coincidentally, in other words, without intention. According to Darwin, there was no plan of creation in the production of these numerous species. He emphasized this in many of his writings. Darwin published his ideas in 1859 in his book On the Origin of Species. He then wanted to provide a detailed mechanism on how acquired traits are inherited. So, years after On the Origin of Species, he published his hypothesis pangenesis, where he assumed that when nature affects the cells of the organism, these somatic cells secrete small particles, which Darwin called gemmules, that aggregate in the reproductive organs of the organism and get passed to its offspring. But where did the common origin come from, Darwin? Where did this primordial form upon which you built your ideas and to which you ascribed all living organisms come from? Darwin did not explain that in his book. But in his correspondence with the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, he conjectured that the primordial form originated in a warm pond by factors such as light, heat, and electricity. Thus, Darwin endorsed the notion of spontaneous generation, prevalent in his time. This notion presumed that living organisms could develop spontaneously from inanimate objects. For example, it was believed that insects originated from leftovers and maggots from rotten meat. These are, in short, the pillars of Darwin's theory of evolution. 1. A living organism somehow emerged from inanimate matter. 2. A nature that grants living organisms new traits that transform them to different species. 3. Acquired traits are inherited. 4th, a nature that selects and compounds complex biological systems through simple successive changes. The conclusion, the tabletop, is that living organisms evolved without intent or will from an intending doer who knows what he's doing. And on this tabletop, Darwin loaded all living organisms in the universe. Now, what is the overall evaluation of these pillars upon which Darwin established his conclusion? As for spontaneous generation, it is a myth that has been refuted experimentally, most famously by Francesco Redi's experiment, 200 years before Darwin. Also, Louis Pasteur's experiment, published 5 years after Darwin's book, proved that the organisms, once believed to be spontaneously generated from inanimate objects like leftovers, actually come from contaminated air and not from the food itself. Indeed, sterilization by pasteurization and pasteurized milk are derived from Pasteur's name. The truth is that it is rationally refuted to imagine a living organism spontaneously emerging from inanimate objects. However, they insisted on testing it, and when they did, the myth was refuted scientifically as well as rationally. As for nature adding new traits to an organism through use and disuse, like the example of the giraffe's neck, it is also a myth, refuted by Gregor Mendel's discoveries. Mendel, years after Darwin, proved that genetic traits of offspring, no matter how varied, will not include anything outside the genetic pool of ancestors. It's also been refuted by findings in epigenetics, which show that external and environmental factors can alter how genetic material is read in an organism, activating certain traits and suppressing others. But they cannot add genetic material that didn't exist in the first place. As for inheritance of acquired traits, it is a myth, as simple observation proves. For example, the muscles that a blacksmith and a carpenter develop in their work aren't inherited by their offspring. However, Darwin's disciples insisted on experimenting with this hypothesis. Weizmann, for instance, cut off the tails of 19 generations of mice and their offspring, only to find out, after all that headache, that the offspring of these mice continued to grow tails. In other words, the acquired trait, the severed tail, wasn't passed down to offspring. Now, what's left of the pillars of Darwin's theory? You will say, natural selection is valid. My reply would be that the valid part of natural selection is neither Darwin's invention nor his brainchild. It's well known that it is harder for a weaker animal to acclimate to difficult environmental conditions. But Darwin's natural selection goes beyond this to mean the emergence of complex biological systems from simple random successive changes. Do you want to understand what natural selection means to Darwin? His wild imagination brought forth the idea that nature and use and disuse gave ancestors simple physical structures that may have provided some benefit. So, natural selection saved them without any foresight that the accumulation of these structures would later produce a fully integrated organ, like the bird's wing or the animal's eye. To understand Darwin's logic, imagine a scrap landfill which is passed by huge numbers of blind people, and each of them randomly picks up a piece of scrap. Then they enter a building via a one-way door that shuts after each person gets inside. Millions of years pass by with blind people picking up scrap and going into the building, where they'll eventually die. One day you open the door of the building, and a giant Boeing plane bursts forth piloted by a blind man and soars into the sky. You wonder, how could the blind man make the plane? You are told that he did not intend to make it, but what happened is that a blind person before him picked up a piece of scrap that was useful, survived longer, and passed it on to those who followed. One picked up a cloth which protected him from the cold. Another picked up a flat piece of metal that shaded him from the sun. One picked up a plane control stick and used it to stir his food while cooking. Another picked up a sheet of glass and used it as a shield in his war against blind enemies. So the blind across different generations passed on scrap to their descendants. Then, unintentionally and without anyone's intervention, the pieces came together to form this great plane that simply took off. Don't you dare harbor the illusion that someone intended the plane to be built or flown. By the same logic, Darwin considered that natural selection blindly patched up the structures of living organisms. So, for example, saying, "Wings help birds fly," is describing their pseudo-purpose, an imaginary purpose, not real. Also, to Darwin, sight is a pseudo-purpose for the eye because there is no willing, intending doer who intended for the eye to see or the wing to flap. Rather, all this resulted from accumulations of blind chance. This is the blind natural selection joke that Darwin came up with. Apart from sounding absurd to every sound mind, it's been invalidated by the scientific discoveries of irreducible complexity in all detailed structures of organisms and their relationships. In other words, the structures and organs of living organisms are so complex and integrated that all parts need to exist at the same time for the system to function. Thus, gradual evolution of the different parts is not possible, even at the level of the smallest unit of life, the cell, which Darwin saw as a mere smudge under the microscope of his day. Therefore, the natural selection portrayed by Darwin is also a myth. Upon such myths, refuted by mind, senses, and experiments, Darwin built the most ridiculous and stupid idea in history, that this finely tuned and magnificent creation came by unintentional chance events, and that it requires no knowledge or wisdom. Now, what's left of Darwin's theory? His delusions, which seem like an entry into a wildest imagination contest, where natural scientists compete to make the audience laugh. What's left is his imagination, which is like bedtime stories of the Frog Prince, the Swan Princess, and Cinderella's mice turning into beautiful horses. But with one addition, the conversion into horses required a very long time. An imagination that puts feathers on mosquito-chasing dinosaurs, then they fly. An imagination where a black bear swimming for hours with its mouth open to swallow as many insects as possible is likened to a whale that opens its mouth to swallow fish. And based on this similarity, Darwin wove a tale of a whale evolving from a bear, as in the facsimile copy of the first edition of On the Origin of Species, page 184. Some might say, but what about Darwin's knowledge? What about the numerous observations he collected in his book and the accuracy of his observations? My reply is that Darwin was like a program with a large amount of input, but with the wrong equation to link this input, thus resulting in a wrong conclusion. Therefore, Darwin's substantial information wasn't of much benefit to him. It is very important to understand that these observations of birds, reptiles, insects, etc. are not part of the theory of evolution. We're here discussing the theory itself that Darwin put forth to explain his observations. Apart from his observations and his coinage of the term natural selection with the wrong meaning, Darwin's innovation was invalid, while his valid input was not new. Yes, Darwin's innovation was invalid, while his valid input was not new. Therefore, it's a mistake to say Darwin's theory has errors, because Darwin's theory is essentially a combination of errors. Myths refuted by mind and science, logical fallacies, and absurd fantasies to reach the conclusion that the fine-tuning and precision in organisms does not require intent, will, or knowledge. Here I want to remind you that our episodes offer a methodology to adjust your compass. The methodological rule we learned today is, falsehood can only be founded on falsehood. It can never stem from correct knowledge or a sound mind. Wherever you apply this rule, you'll find it to be true. We saw an example in today's episode, Darwin's myth that organisms are a product of chance. Some might wonder, didn't scientists after Darwin fill in the theory's gaps and correct its errors? How do you account for the fossil evidence, the molecular biology evidence, the embryology evidence, vestigial organs? Can't we reconcile Darwin's theory with Allah's existence? If it is a myth, as you say, why do most Western scientists believe in it? We will answer all these questions methodically, Allah willing, starting with the claim that the theory's gaps have been addressed and its errors corrected in our next important episode. So stay tuned. Allah is the granter of success. Peace and mercy be upon you.